the noble goal of economics is to show people how little they understand about things they think they can design. So that above all, the main problem is that people who think they know how cities work are trying to design them.
Hello, I'm Daniel Freeman here at the IEA. Today we're here to discuss free cities and market solutions to the problems of modern urbanism. I'm delighted to be here today with Dr. Vera Kichanova. Vera is a senior economist at the Free Cities Foundation and also works at Zaha Hadid Architects as an urban policy advisor. Vera's political career began at the age of 20 when she was elected as the first libertarian candidate to Moscow's municipal council. Since then, she has worked as editor-in-chief for the Atlas Network in Kiev and has been the president of the Oxford Hayek Society. Vera holds a PhD in political economy from King's College London, a master's in public policy from the University of Oxford, and a BA in journalism from Moscow State University. Vera, it's great to have you here.
Thank you very much, Daniel.
So, Vera, you work for the Free Cities Foundation. I wonder if, first off, you could just tell me, what is a free city?
That's a great question to start. Thank you. So a free city is sort of an umbrella term that we use for all kinds of territories, self-governing territories that uphold individual rights and freedoms. So they can be different kinds, different types of those. Those can be charter cities, those can be other types of special jurisdictions like special economic zones, prosperity zones. That's a term that frequently is used in Africa. They don't have to necessarily have the legal autonomy, so they can be just de facto self-governed territories. They can be proprietary communities, home ownership associations, where residents have a much higher degree of influence over how their community is governed compared to normal conventional municipality. They can be intentional communities where people with the value freedom just get together voluntarily and build something from scratch. And we at the Free Cities Foundation, we are supporting all kinds of these initiatives, all the beginnings all over the world. So we are creating and maintaining a network of people doing these things in different parts of the world, from the charter cities in Honduras to prosperity zones in Africa to intentional communities in Montenegro and Germany and Spain and Canada and the US. And so we advise them, we spread the words about this. We look at and I personally, as a senior economist, one of my roles is to look at the examples from history, how it used to work, how it works now. So something that has been overlooked. So people don't know that a lot of solutions have already been tried successfully, and we want to spread the word and spread these solutions.
Okay, that's really interesting. So for you, one of the main ideas about them is that they have a degree of, even though they're very much part of a country, they have a degree of autonomy within them, whether that's slightly separate regulatory rules or separate tax laws, things like that.
Yes.
What's the idea behind them? What are the sort of problems that you can say a free city will help alleviate?
Well, we have a lot of urban problems. If I start, we won't have time to finish it. And every urban dweller can name them. These are the housing crisis, cost crisis, the transport, the absolutely dysfunctional regulatory land use system and zoning laws, as it's
or planning in Britain.
Planning, yeah, and above all, if you remember what was Hayek's quote, that the noble goal of economics is to show people how little they understand about things they think they can design. So that above all, the main problem is that people who think they know how cities work are trying to design them and design our day-to-day life. And a lot of other things come from that. And free cities are just cities where the feedback mechanisms are much better. Again, if we remember Hayek, in mid-20th century, he came up with this brilliant idea that the price mechanism is the best, most efficient feedback mechanism. That's it, revealing the ever-changing preferences of the society, of different people in the society, better than any polls, better than any voting, any democratic tools, as much as they can be, efficient at some level. And since then, they haven't been found any better way. So free cities, they have this price mechanism embedded in it. So they provide a better, they provide more choice between rules. So of course you can move from one city to another now but that it involves massive transaction costs, and the difference might be not that striking.
Right. Yeah.
So free cities provide they provide a market opportunity for people, entrepreneurs who can find the rules that potential citizens cherish more. They can provide more choice for us residents, and they can stimulate the institutional evolution for search of better ways to live together, to govern cities.
Yeah. Okay, so this would be generally a private company setting up a city and organizing the public services in this city.
That's one of the options, yes.
One of the options. Does it necessarily involve private actors, or could it be run by, say, an external state?
That's a tricky question. Well, it doesn't have to be, a classic company. Well, there is no one-size-fits-all company. Like private cities are like private companies. They can be governed in a more top-down way, more horizontal way. They can be like a cooperative where they can have more democracy or less democracy depending on what people want who live there and what works better. So with a foreign country, that's a very good question, because charter cities, which I mentioned, so the concept was popularized by Paul Romer, economist who won the Nobel Prize in economics in 2018. And he came up with that idea of a city that would have a foreign guarantor nation, so his idea was that every developing, look at Hong Kong, like this model that has functioned for decades, and unfortunately we've seen that it's not a panacea either, because China is doing to Hong Kong
vulnerable.
It's vulnerable, but until some point it was everyone's favorite success story. One country, two systems, autonomous zone, self-governing, city-state. And his idea was that every developing country needs its own Hong Kong.
Right.
And Paul Romer's idea was that you need a foreign guarantor, like it was the United Kingdom for Hong Kong, that will protect investors' rights. So you create the special economic zones governed with the help of the foreign guarantor. And of course, these things are very controversial, because
it sounds a bit like neocolonialism.
Yes. And it was tried in Honduras, and it's created a lot of backlash. And they had to, the people who were building these charter cities, then Paul Romer left the team. That's another story. But the thing is, the charter cities in Honduras that are being built now, they don't have this guarantor nation, because the community of people who were advancing this idea, it became obvious, it became evident that it's not about developed countries coming to developing countries and telling them how to live. It's about people gaining more opportunities from the bottom up. Local people having more say on how they want to live.
Right, I see. And it's interesting that you mentioned the charter cities or ZEDs of Honduras. Do you have any other examples of people around the world experimenting with these kind of ideas of free cities, charter cities, And could you talk a bit about that?
Yes, obviously. So again, well, you're talking specifically about charter cities, or are you talking about like in a broader
Well,
sense?
in a broader sense of privately established
Well,
cities.
in a broader sense, for example, it's a big deal in Africa now. There is, I think, several dozens of cities in Kenya, in Nigeria, in Malawi, and where else? In Democratic Republic of Congo and other places that are where basically, it's a very fast or rapidly urbanizing continent, and many countries that are rapidly urbanizing, the government just cannot catch up with the provision of urban infrastructure. And sometimes they understand, well, we don't have any other choice other than to outsource this to the private sector. And that works out in some ways. So in India, we have examples like that, where private sector is building cities from scratch. Well, in China, there are contract cities, but it's a slightly more, it's a more sophisticated model, because China is an authoritarian state, and you can never. That's the biggest problem. That's what I call the catch-22 problem of private cities. That countries they need the most are also the most vulnerable, because countries they need the most are countries where public institutions are generally failing.
Yeah.
But these are also the countries where investing because it's a huge upfront investment. Building a new city.
Why would you invest if
so
it could all just be
high
taken
risk,
away?
high return potentially, but to prove that it's not just high risk by high return, we need more success stories.
Right. You mentioned India, and that's quite interesting, because you recently wrote a very interesting report on this city of Lavasa in Western India. Could you tell us a bit more about this as an example?
Yeah, this is a very interesting case. So the city of Lavasa is a private city that is located in Maharashtra province, which is where Mumbai is the capital. And it was, if you look at the photos, you would think it's somewhere in the Italian Riviera. So because the idea was to create, the refuge of everything that people hate about Indian big cities, like pollution. Delhi is the most polluted city in the world. Mumbai has some of the largest slums in the world, and so a developer came up with the idea, like, let's create something opposite of that. And it was a very interesting story, because for a while it was growing organically quite successfely. They had several thousands of residents, and the greatest thing about Lavasa is that it was from the very beginning not meant as an enclave for the rich, the affluent people, whether Indians or expats, but it was meant to be a city for everyone. The idea was that we give. So the developer was buying land from the local people in exchange for the jobs that they would give them. So first in construction, and then in service economy. A lot of services were provided for free for people who had always lived, a very poor life in the villages, never seen, who's never had running water, who's never were able to send their kids to school. They were now able to send their kids to English-speaking schools. Yeah. And there were several there was an educational courses for hospitality courses, because Lavasa was also meant to be a tourist resort, and it was growing like that, and it became popular with tourists. It became it started growing as a residential community, and then the NIMBYs came.
The eternal enemy.
Yes, and that's another story. So there was this countrywide left-wing movement that was fighting Lavasa under the pretext of the environmental damage. And the most revealing thing is that local people were coming to the court, coming to the media, saying Lavasa made this place greener, Lavasa made this place cleaner. We are happy with that. We're not suffering. These people, they have nothing to do with us. They're not defending our rights. They just came from somewhere, from big cities. They are just a political movement who are trying to gain some points, pretending to find. And so for about 10 years, these local people who stayed there, they were petitioning the government, and finally it was revived. The new developer was found, and now, while it's still an unfinished story, I talked to people who live there. Well, because I wrote my PhD about private cities, so that was one of the bonuses of my academic work, because I was talking to many people who are involved in these projects all over the world, who are developing them, investing in them, or consulting them, or want to move there, start a business there, and figuring out what motivates them.
Yeah. So you mentioned that Lavasa has this huge problem with, as you describe it, NIMBYism. What are some of the other roadblocks that have prevented this idea from becoming more widespread, and how might these be overcome in your view?
That's a great question. So from what I have seen, my analysis of these projects, you can generally classify all the roadblocks into three categories. So first one is what I call conventional economic roadblocks, costs, problems that you have to overcome, you have to address. These are, as I say, fairly conventional. Building a city from scratch is a very complex business, which involves huge upfront costs, a lot of planning. You need to get enough assembled land in not just somewhere in the middle of nowhere, in the middle of the desert, but in a prime location where people would want to move. You need to plan it. You need to realize who are your target audience, who you want to move there. So, but again, we don't have a shortage of large-scale infrastructure projects per se. So yes, many of these problems are quite common for any. So these are difficult, but these are solvable, and we've seen examples of cities built from scratch. The second one is the regulatory costs. So this involves things like getting especially if you are pursuing special jurisdiction status. You need to either find a country that already has this clause, like Honduras has this zones of economic development and employment. The new government shut down that program, so they're not canceling those that already were granted this status, but you cannot create new, unfortunately. Right. Maybe this will be reversed when they see that those two that are running are bringing fruits. But it's very political. Or you have to, find a country that's, theoretically open to these solutions, like many countries in Africa, as I mentioned, because they might have no other choice, or just because the stars have so aligned that there are pragmatic people in the government, and persuade them that, this worked here, why don't we try it here? And so get regulations is very, very, very tricky. And so if you look at developed, rich democratic countries, there's less instability, but there's also much less flexibility. There's the classical NIMBY problem. Reminds me that story how Google tried to build a smart city in Canada, and which was, which failed miserably because of, again, the grassroots position, because people were, crying that Google is going to spy on us, and that's Google, and so one of the biggest companies in the world. Yeah. So this is the second problem. And then the third problem, which I mentioned, this is political. It's not the same as regulatory, because regulatory, you just need to, in theory, you just need to find the right regime that allows it and do the paperwork. Political is when external forces, intervene, and suddenly what you have on paper doesn't really work.
Right, I see. So obviously we have these problems that are caused sort of external to the market, of NIMBYism, of the political issues, of regulatory issues. But also, isn't there a point that we talk about competition and Hayek and how companies are great, and I fully agree with that, but isn't the question when it comes to free cities that companies also fail, and they fail quite frequently for a huge range of reasons? If you're establishing, if you're, say, a country in Africa and you're thinking about establishing one of these cities, isn't your concern going to be that, okay, what happens if we establish this and for one reason or another, even if we're totally on board with it, it doesn't work out? Are we left in a situation where we have a huge project that is simply too big to fail, and then it ends up being forced onto the government's books? How do you respond to that kind of concern?
Yeah, that's a valid concern, and this is absolutely true that private companies fail, which is part of the the learning procedure, the discovery procedure. Again, if we are back to Hayek, that one company's failures is a lesson for many other companies who want to work in this field. And the same,
but it might suck a bit for the people who already live there.
The same goes for cities. But again, one thing is, we are talking, especially if we talk about the developing poor countries, about countries where, well, it can get worse. I mean, if you look at in theory it can, but you see that a lot of people are leaving the countries they were born in search for, like, all these tragic news stories of people drowning in the Mediterranean Sea because. So you can see how desperate these people are and how bad they are where they come from. So isn't it worth to try doing something better? And isn't it,
better than doing nothing?
Better than doing nothing. Secondly, we need more experiments like that, because then we'll have more successful cases like that. It's not about it. Yeah, that's another thing that is important for everyone who are invested in this free cities movement, that you don't put all the eggs in one basket. You the more attempts you have, the more successful attempts you will have. So again, people are in poor countries, they are very mobile, they are ready to move to a better place, and if you have several projects like that in one country or in neighboring countries, then if one of them fails, and then the other might work, learning from the first one. And so far, if you look at those, and the third thing is that you don't, you start small. You don't, create 5 billion. No, what was this? Yeah, in the Saudi, the NEOM project.
The line.
The 2 million. No, the whole NEOM project, the line is just part of that. The idea was, we invest $500 billion and we create a 2 billion city by 2030. You don't do it like that. You start small. You are building, I don't know, first a small community, or you can. You involve, for example, you can invite what's called a core tenant. It can be a factory, it can be a university. University is a good thing because it attracts transient populations, so people who are already eager to move to a new place.
So this is, in your view, these should be very long-term projects over decades or generations, rather than something that you just say, right, in 5 years we're going to build Hong Kong. So actually, on that point, that brings up the question of politics and administration, because in a lot of these models, the idea is at first, at least, these are going to have a board of directors of these investors who basically run the city. Now, my question is there necessarily a role, in your view, for local democracy in these cities, especially when we're thinking, okay, let's say one of these is successful. What about in 20, 30 years when there are people who've been born in this city? Are they going to have to just accept the initial charter or leave?
That is a wonderful question. And again, if we look at the Honduran, so there are currently two cities under development, charter cities, Ciudad Morazan and Prospera. Prospera is the one that our company, Zafarid Architects, is partially designing, and we at the Free Cities Foundation, we are involved in both. As you know, we have even one of my colleagues moved from America to live in the Morazan.
Oh, okay.
So that's how much we believe in it. And Prospera, for example, they introduced a very sophisticated multi-level structure of gradually implementing democratic institutions. So until the population reaches 1,000, it's basically governed by board of directors, as you called it. It's called the council in Prospera, but it's similar to that. Then they have some democratic tools. I don't remember the exact details, but I think they start electing this. So at first, the developer is appointing these councillors. Then people start electing them. Then when it reaches 10,000, hopefully then they elect mayor, and then they can, then they can, they have much more power over. So the developer, and this is beneficial for everyone, including the developer, because people want to have a say, people want to have a choice. They sign. The idea of these cities is that they are based on explicit contract. They are completely consensual. You move even only if they are built. That's very important. They are built on green field where nobody lives. No one is evicted. If somebody is building a charter city, if somebody is building a new city, like again the Saudi examples, when they are evicting indigenous population, it's not that model. It's something completely different. And but this is not a universal. There's no one size fits all. There is another example that I like is the city of Irvine in California in the US. It was built privately entirely, and at some point in the 60s, it was the largest master plan city in the US, and it is completely ranked among the greenest, happiest, the greenest, happiest, safest, and so on cities in the US. They have a university there. It's, people love it who live there. And most people don't know it was built privately. It was entirely private, like 100% until 1971, when the developer decided to introduce, to incorporate and introduce an elected council. A question is why? And I talked to people from Irvine who are in the municipal government, who are in the university teaching urban, including studying the history of Irvine. And I was asking this question, and they said, well, because they wanted to keep attracting, because they were built around a university, they partnered with a university campus, and they wanted to keep attracting very educated, very active, socially active population, and that kind of population wanted to have a say. And
so there's clearly a financial incentive in introducing a local democracy, even for the developers. Well, that's about all we've got time for. Thank you for coming, Vera. It's been incredibly interesting, and thank you at home for watching. If you did like the video, please consider liking it and also subscribe.
Well, if you enjoyed that conversation, why not watch one of these other videos? And while you're here, remember to hit the subscribe button and the notification bell. That way, you'll never miss out on a single IEA broadcast.